Welcome Internet to Psychologist Casual Review. Today we're going to be reviewing the analyst, symbolization and the absence in the analytical setting, in parentheses on change in the analytical practice and analytical experience by André Green. And it's an article that is written in memory of Winnicott. So before we start the article proper, I need to set the context of this article, as it is paramount for the understanding of the whole article. So this article was written in 1975 in a period where psychoanalysis was undergoing a sort of crisis. A crisis, why? Because there started to be more and more emphasis on non-neurotic, non-psychotic patients, which at that point in time were referenced under a lot of names and a lot of concepts, namely and most prominently the as-if personality, schizoid personality, the borderline personality, the blank psychosis, and so on and so forth. So you can understand that it was a multitude of languages that was starting to come forward to define a very interesting phenomena, one which was no longer discussed as such. Like, there was a time in psychoanalysis, even prior to that, in which there was a real discussion of, are those people psychotic or neurotic? We're no longer into that discussion at the time of the article. At that point, the fundamental core question is, who are these people, and are these people capable of experiencing psychoanalysis proper? Are they analyzable, to put it frankly? And André Green is going to basically try and think about the question, not come to a conclusion, not necessarily reach a conclusion or an answer, but he's going to try and think about it. So the first thing he's going to say is that this whole context has created this form of uneasiness, a sort of malaise, as we would say in French, i.e. a feeling of genuine unease in the scientific psychoanalytic community, because no one quite knew exactly what should be done for these people, because there were two types of analysts at that period. There were those who felt that non-neurotics, including the, let's say, the borderlines, like as an umbrella term, the borderlines were not analyzable. And I have to precise here, when I'm saying borderline, I'm not saying borderline personality disorder. I'm like using it in this French psychoanalytic way of état limite, meaning like everything that isn't plainly neurotic, psychotic, perverted, like a third group, right? So fundamentally, this third group, the big question was, can they go through psychoanalysis? And it seems that there were two basic 10 forms of schools on this. There was the Orthodox school that felt that they could not be analyzed and that it was at the risk of the clinician to do so. And there was the more progressive side that felt that under certain circumstances and under certain specific conditions, they could be. So Green's perspective is that things have changed, undoubtedly. And that change was not just that we were discovering these new patients. It was also that we were starting to be able to hear them in the more archaic side of their personalities. This was no longer about finding the neurotic and working on neurotic problems. It was about working on psychotic issues with the personality in non-neurotic individuals. And this non-neurotic individual is going to be something is, how can I say, a form of very painful issue in psychoanalysis, as at the time, the paradigms, and there were paradigms to think about them, for example, Fernburn or, for example, Dutch, but it was straying away from the old psychoanalysis that was taught and in training. And you can see that even Green has a form of nostalgia, as he says that even though the herring of contemporary psychoanalysis at that time was different from before, he does state that it's not better, it's quite the inverse, it's kind of worse. So you can see that even Green is very ambivalent on all of this. So for him, he doesn't go so far as to say that everyone can be analyzed, like he doesn't say that, but he also doesn't think that it's a clear and cut issue. It's a very subtle issue that depends on the analyst, their will, the will of the patient, and what is manageable, and of course the setting and the respectfulness of the setting of both parties. So you can see that it's a very complicated issue. And it's an issue at that time when they didn't necessarily have all the tools we now have. As, for example, people like Kernberg were starting to write, but they were not as prominent as they are now. So it was a moment of fluctuation. So fundamentally, for Green, what he's going to argue is that these people have to be given a chance to be analyzed, even if it's not by, let's say, Green himself. He said that he might not be able to do it, but someone else, another analyst, might be able to work with them perfectly well. The idea here is that it's not about are they analyzable per se, but by whom? And that's a very good question, because it also relates to what Rollo May stated in Power and Innocence, that people that cannot be analyzed also show, in part, failure of the analyst to work with them, rather than the failure of the patient. For Green, the real true failure of analysts is that if they have someone in analysis, they have to be able to guide them in their own subjectivity, to make their own psychic life reality for themselves. This can be an issue for certain types of borderline individuals, like, for example, what we call in French les pensées opératoires, or les processus psychosomatiques. I'm going to explain, don't worry. Operational thinking is a fundamental idea in which, for de Muson, in which the person cannot express fantasies, have ideals, daydreams, and so on and so forth. And therefore, they're going to repress that. And what's going to talk is the body. So the body is going to take center stage rather than the mind. And the body is going to have psychosomatic issues. So he says that in these cases, and even for, let's say, proper, what we would call borderline personality disorders, now people that are acting out, or people that withdraw, which we now call schizoid, for all of these people, the goal of the analysis is to be able to show them their own subjectivity in the context of analysis. So for him, the very core of what is worked with these people is very different from neurotics, because neurotics don't need that much help from the object, i.e. the relationship. They're able, with just subtle guidance, to be able to work by themselves. They can even tolerate the silence of the analyst quite well, without much difficulty. These people, on the other hand, the borderlines umbrella term, are not quite capable of that, because of for Green, because for them, it's not just that the analyst is a representation of the primary caregiver, it's that the analyst themselves becomes the primary caregiver. How so? It's because fundamentally there's been complete breakdown of the relationship at the very start. Therefore, those people never had that primary caregiver relationship. Therefore, it's going back to the very start with them. It's not like the neurotics where they already have all of that and you're just deconstructing what has happened. Here with the borderlines, you are constructing from the very get-go. You are creating something. It's not just a matter of going back into the past. It's a matter of making something that wasn't there. So it's a much more tricky process. So what happens is that for him, what's going to be fundamental is to help those individuals symbolize, i.e. create a symbol. it's not something that's taken lightly in the text. It's not about like, because the symbol itself is an act of being, and it's also, very importantly, an act of separation. Once the relationship is created, it also goes through the fact of having to separate, and symbolization is a form of separation, as the phenomena, the sin in itself, if we are to talk about Kant, is different from the symbol we have from it. Therefore, that fundamental leap creates a separation. Something of he feels that an analyst has to also be in a father figure role as well as in a maternal role, because what's going to happen is that the relationship needs to be created, right, as a la Winnicott, where it's going to be a regression, it's going to be massive early archaic processes, but the setting and the symbol created by the analyst are going to be like a father, preventing the complete engulfment of both mother and child. So to make things very more simple, is that what happens is that to prevent in a way, the fusion between analyst and patient, the setting is going to play the role of a third party. It's going to put limitations on this fusion mode state. And that's why it's so important to keep the setting in the background of your mind. Whereas neurotics, and a clinician can be more, let's say, more adventurous with the setting. For someone with under the borderline umbrella, it's very important to have very clear, very stable setting. Even though it might feel countertransferentially quite hard to hold, it's very important because for them it's a source of reassurance. It's always the same, it's always going to be the same, and there's something that's profoundly secure about that. If, for example, you've already observed children, there's a point in their lives where they're always asked to be read the same tale. Well, it's a bit of the same. The frame and the setting are that same tale. It's the sin that is consistent and is not going to default. So therefore, it's very important. And he feels that it's a father role, that separation aspect, which is in line with Lacan's theories about the father and the role of the father as the separator in the Oedipus complex. So he also says that what happens is that there has to be also an understanding of countertransference. It's no longer just about the transference, i.e. when the person projects. It's about what the clinician feels, because that's because of the early archaic nature of the processes. It's not just what is thrown onto the analyst, but what is recuperated within the analyst, and what the analyst can use of his understanding of the patient to be able to transform it and to create a reverie, as Bion would say, i.e. a form of daydreaming with the patient, to allow them to have access to a form of psychic development, psychic maturation. And there's also this quite important aspect that he talks about, that these individuals themselves are prone to primary narcissism. And there's a whole point at the tail end of the article of, is this primary narcissism a unification, i.e. a la Winnicott, in which the individual goes back into himself and unites, or is it quite the opposite of the individual goes back to nothingness, zero, to the death drive? And it seems that for Green, there is more of the death drive than there is the unification process, even though there is both. But it's a subtle process, as it can go in one way or in another, and it's much more likely to go into the other, given the mental fragility of these individuals. So there's always a death drive lurking in the self-destruction to go back to zero, to nothingness. And therefore, this behavior is to be understood as a tentative to try and lower the drives to nothingness, to form a certain form of peace and quiet, which they can't get with the object, even if they try. So fundamentally, the analyst object is going to have to work through wisdom to try and create a transitional space in which absence becomes both creative and fulfilling. So what does he mean by that? He means that, for example, emptiness. From emptiness is born space, is born something, because it's empty and then it's filled. But you can't fill it in through brutal interpretations. Not all the time, at least, because that would be too intrusive, too destructive, because the identity is not solid enough to deal with that. So what happens is that there has to be a form of play between presence and absence, i.e. what is full and what is empty. So that form of play is going to create the perfect conditions for the patient who has borderline issues, to fill in themselves with the clinician's ideas, interpretations, thoughts and feelings, while also be able to tolerate the absence and to be able to create and to recreate the analyst through the absence. And it's that back and forth between both creation and aloneness that makes the patient develop resources and makes them grow their identity to a solid point, or a more solid point than they were. And it's a very important point, and I think he's quite right, that borderline patients need that back and forth. And it reminds me also about what Kernberg talks about, is that you have to have two lines of interpretation with these people. You have to have, of course, the early understanding of, for example, destructiveness, persecution, and aggression, but you also have to have a more subtle, more soft understanding at the same time. And sometimes you have to switch from one and the other, again, switching from one another, which that switch is an important idea in the text, as it's about also understanding the split is not just good and bad, it's also present and absent. It's also full and empty. The split is not only good and bad, because that's a simplification of Kleinian theory. And finally, what is I found of very high importance in the text is this fundamental idea that the discussion is not closed. And I feel that even nowadays, the question of the borderlines is still a very lively conversation, as a lot of tenets of object relations have been implemented, but not to every line of thinking and not to every current. For example, the Lacanians don't really deal with object relations, and Orthodox Freudians tend to avoid it. So we see that even nowadays that article still rings very true. There's still a lot of things to be developed and a lot of discussions to be had inside of psychoanalysis. And I found that to be very interesting, because in a way this article still remains quite contemporary, even though it was virtually written 50 years ago, and I found it of high interest and I would highly recommend it. However, I wouldn't recommend it as your first read in psychoanalysis, because very, very, very technical. He doesn't shy away from just talking about technique, about concepts, and doesn't really define them. So if it's the first text you read, it's going to be a very, very, very hard read, and I would advise you to read virtually anything else, but not this article first. So I hope you like this review. If you want to ask anything or have any statements, please feel free to put them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.